For decades, the studies and predictions of Edgar Cayce have remained like isolated pieces of a spiritual puzzle that few dared to explore completely. Among his many revelations, there is one in particular that has been drawing attention recently: an enigmatic vision concerning the choice of a new pope and the arrival of a new cycle for the elderly. For many, these words seem distant and symbolic, but recent events in the Vatican, coupled with the silent shift we see on the streets, in families and in institutions, point to something larger. What Cayce saw was not just an isolated event, but a sign of a new era, a time when older people would cease to be invisible, beginning to occupy a space of awareness and respect that has been denied to them for generations. But what exactly did he say about this? And why now, with a new pope, does everything seem to align? This revelation, though old, has never made as much sense as it does now. When Cayce mentioned a spiritual leadership that would bring to the fore the forgotten value of the elderly, many interpreted it as a metaphor for wisdom. However, in light of current events, his words take on a new meaning. The recent papal announcement has rekindled the debate about the role of seniors in our society, especially among those over 60 who have for too long felt marginalized. The new pontificate seems to carry with it not only religious symbols, but a direct call to the dignity and worth of this generation. If you've ever felt left out or unheard as the years go by, perhaps this is the time to look at yourself with fresh eyes. And if this topic touches you in some way, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment. It could be the start of an important conversation. According to the records of Cayce's readings, there would be a time when the wisdom of the elderly would once again be essential. He foresaw a subtle but profound movement where spiritual leaders, including a central figure linked to the Vatican, would bring about a turnaround in social and family structures. The way we treat our elders would change, not out of obligation, but out of a new collective consciousness. Interestingly, this movement would begin after an unexpected transition in the leadership of the Church, marked by signs of humility, active listening, and openness to the past. Could this new pope be the catalyst for all of this? Some say yes, pointing to simple but symbolic gestures that are already being observed. Cayce did not mention names or dates, but he clearly described the spirit of the change. And now more than ever, that spirit seems to be in the air. This turnaround, predicted by Cayce, would not come about through speeches or decrees. It would be born in small gestures, like the way we look at our parents and grandparents, how we listen to their stories and acknowledge their pain. The new leadership of the Church, unlike previous figures marked by formalism, would come with a more humane, approachable, and sensitive demeanor. And almost silently, this change would inspire other institutions to rethink the presence of older people in roles of influence. For Cayce, this was not just a social trend, but a spiritual necessity of our time. He believed that only by reintegrating the elderly into the center of decisions could we find balance between tradition and renewal. And as the new pope speaks more frequently on topics such as listening, reconciliation, and remembrance, many see this as the progressive fulfillment of that ancient vision. For a long time, society moved in the opposite direction. It praised youth, immediate productivity, speed. The elderly were pushed to the sidelines, treated as a transitional phase, not as a pillar of continuity. Cayce warned about the risks of this model. He said that a civilization that ignores its elders is doomed to repeat the same mistakes. And it's not just about reverence for the elderly, but about the practical wisdom accumulated throughout life. What is now beginning to change, with this new era announced in the Vatican, is the revaluation of experience. Every speech by the new pope that mentions grandparents, every gesture that includes the forgotten, is perceived by some scholars as part of the beginning of this transformation. Perhaps we are living in the very moment when that prediction is being fulfilled most clearly. For those who have followed Cayce's readings for longer, this is a moment for attention. He described that this change would not be marked by grandiose events, but by an inner awakening that would begin to spread among the simplest people. There would be no official announcement, but a shared feeling that something is finally changing. And this can already be felt. In prayer groups, in nursing homes, in conversations between generations, A new willingness seems to be emerging. People are going back to asking, listening, and including. Cayce said that this would be the biggest revolution, when the elderly would cease to be tolerated and would begin to be sought out. The new Pope, with his serene yet firm manner, seems to set the tone for this turnaround, and that tone echoes like an answer to a promise made so long ago. Although Cayce was often interpreted as a mystic, distant from institutional reality, his words now speak directly to the present. When he spoke of the importance of elders as guardians of memory and as bridges between the spiritual and everyday world, he seemed to touch on a point that the modern world has forgotten. Today, with the choice of a pope who insists on listening, humility, and valuing memory, these ideas take shape. In visits to nursing homes, in receiving letters from the elderly, and in frequently mentioning loneliness in old age, the new spiritual leader seems to heed an ancient call. Not as someone who read Cayce, but as someone who incorporates in a natural way what was predicted. There is an alignment that cannot be explained only by coincidence. Cayce's message seems to come to life through a pope who, without great promises, plants seeds of silent and lasting change. This possible confirmation of the prophecy does not come from conspiracy theories or forced attempts at connection. It arises from the observation of patterns. The aging of the world's population is a concrete fact, as is the increase in loneliness among the elderly. Public policies have failed to accommodate this generation, but something new seems to be moving from an unexpected place. When Cayce stated that the change coming from the Vatican would inspire a new look at the elderly, he was not suggesting a political plan, but a collective impulse. And that is what many are beginning to perceive. The growing number of community initiatives aimed at including the elderly, the space given to their voices in the media, and the increasing discussion about active longevity are indications that we are at a turning point. A point that may have been imagined decades ago, and that is now beginning to materialize. But why would Cayce give so much importance to the role of the elderly in a time of global transition? The answer may lie in his vision of time as a cycle of learning. For him, humanity walks in circles, learning and relearning fundamental lessons. The elderly would be the custodians of these lessons, and only by listening to them could we move forward without repeating the same mistakes. Therefore, when he relates the emergence of a new spiritual leadership with the resumption of listening to the elderly, he speaks not only of respect, but of moral and social survival. The new Pope, by opening space for this type of listening, may be helping humanity to remember something essential. And perhaps that is the true prophecy coming true, that no progress will be possible if we do not know how to honor those who have already walked the path before us. Another striking point in Cayce's readings is the idea of collective healing through reconnection with the past. He said that many diseases of the soul are born from forgetting roots, and that societies that deny their elders are, in fact, denying part of themselves. This vision goes beyond the spiritual. It touches the emotional, cultural, and even political field. When we see a global religious leader reinforce the importance of intergenerational listening and the active presence of older people in public life, we realize how this movement has profound implications. It is not just about including, but about rebuilding. The era of forgotten elderly is little by little being replaced by an era of reconnection. And the most interesting thing is that this change does not depend on large resources or structures. It begins at home, in the way each one chooses to see and treat those who came before. The transformation is silent, but real. This reconnection that Cayce anticipated also carries a message of responsibility. He said that the youngest would not only benefit from the wisdom of the elders, but would also have the duty to ensure that this wisdom was transmitted. The new Pope, by speaking simply about family, listening, and care, acts as a catalyst for this transmission. His gestures are not only symbolic, but operate as reminders of something essential that has been lost over time. Technology, the fast pace of life, and social changes pushed the elderly into silence. But now, driven by a leadership that values the human above the functional, many are returning to speak, and more importantly, they are being heard. Cayce did not predict this as a natural consequence of evolution, but as a conscious choice that humanity would need to make. There is something deeply human in this choice. By looking back at our parents, grandparents, teachers, and older neighbors, we realize that there is a wealth that cannot be replaced by any modern advance. Cayce believed that each generation has an essential role in the balance of the world, and that harmony is only possible when there is dialogue between them. The new era that begins with the change in the Vatican seems to be, therefore, an invitation to this dialogue, a call to reverse the cycle of forgetfulness that has marked the last decades. And this reversal is already underway, even if still timidly. Families are rescuing traditions, communities are revaluing local stories, and the elderly are gradually regaining the confidence to share what they know. And perhaps this is where the true transformation announced by Cayce lies. As this transformation spreads, many begin to realize that it is not only a moral rescue, but also a historical correction. Cayce saw the marginalization of the elderly as a symptom of collective imbalance, and stated that as long as society insisted on ignoring those who carry the memory, we would live repeating mistakes without understanding their causes. The new Pope, by valuing the testimonies of the elderly and opening space for their experiences, may be leading a silent but essential adjustment. This is not an isolated movement. In different parts of the world, signs emerge that the time of invisibility is coming to an end. It is as if a key has been turned, and what once seemed outdated is once again being recognized as fundamental. The respect that has been denied to the elderly for so long is now being redirected, not as charity but as justice. Cayce also mentioned that this new era would be accompanied by a collective feeling of urgency. People would begin to feel almost intuitively that it was time to repair lost ties. And that's what we see happening. Not only in the religious or institutional spheres, but in homes, in communities, in the simple encounters of everyday life. There is a hunger for reconnection, for stories, for meaning. The elderly, once seen as dependent, are again sought out as advisors, as bridges between what we were and what we can still be. The Pope, with his open attitude to dialogue and his emphasis on listening to the most vulnerable, represents much more than a figure of authority. He becomes a symbol of a cultural shift, a point of support for society to remember that aging is not disappearing, but accumulating value. And that reminder is perhaps the strongest sign that Cayce was right. The most impressive thing about all this is the naturalness with which these changes have been happening. There is no grand plan behind it, no massive campaign or state intervention. There is only a convergence of attitudes that point in the same direction. Cayce spoke exactly about this, that the change would come organically, from the inside out, guided by a collective consciousness that would begin to reorganize itself. The choice of the new Pope, with his welcoming profile and attention to the forgotten, seems to have been the trigger that was missing to activate this social memory. And that is how, little by little, the time of the forgotten elderly is giving way to a new phase. A phase where each wrinkle carries respect, each story is heard with attention, and each presence is valued. The world, still in transition, seems finally willing to remember that aging is also resisting. This movement of returning to the valorization of the elderly has an impact that goes beyond family relationships. It reaches broader social structures, influencing public policies, cultural debates, and even economic decisions. Cayce suggested that by reintegrating the elderly as active agents of social life, we would also be restoring a sense of balance needed to get through difficult times. And the current times, marked by uncertainties and rapid changes, show how much this wisdom can be missing. The current leadership of the Vatican, by promoting a more inclusive and humane view of old age, points to paths that other institutions are beginning to follow. It is no longer just about recognizing the elderly, but about truly listening to them. And that in itself has transformative power. It is the kind of change that does not need to be imposed, because it makes sense on its own. And when something makes sense, it finds room to flourish. Cayce never presented his visions as immutable truths, but as possibilities aligned with our level of consciousness. Therefore, the fulfillment of his predictions depends directly on our choices. When he spoke about a new time for the elderly, he made it clear that this future would not come automatically. It would require sensitivity, courage, and above all, willingness to change old patterns. What we see today, with the new Pope being received with respect and hope by a generation that previously felt forgotten, is evidence that this willingness is emerging. The way he speaks to the elderly, not with pity, but with admiration, shows that the value of experience is finally being recognized, and the more people adopt this view, the more alive Cayce's prophecy will become. Because it is not fulfilled in heaven, it is fulfilled in the human gaze. When one observes this change with attention, one realizes that it also brings a responsibility. Valuing the elderly is not just a gesture of affection, but an ethical choice. It is admitting that memory has value. It is recognizing that the time lived brings lessons that cannot be ignored. The new Pope, by bringing the elderly back to the center of spiritual discourse, is sending a powerful message to all generations. He shows that there is no possible future without respect for the past, and that a just society is not measured only by its innovation, but by its ability to care for those who have already walked a long way. Cayce knew this, and by pointing to a new era marked by reconnection, he gave us not only a prediction, but a direction. It is up to each of us to decide whether we will follow this path or continue to ignore a value that is before our eyes. This path of reconnection, as anticipated by Cayce, is neither quick nor free of resistance. There are still many places where the elderly are treated as a burden, where their voices are silenced by the rush of the modern world. However, the change has already begun, and this is visible in small attitudes. Young people who go back to living with their grandparents, schools that invite elders to share stories, communities that organize intergenerational conversation circles. All of this makes up the new scenario that Cayce envisioned. A scenario where experience is considered part of the solution, not the problem. The new Pope, by giving visibility to these practices, acts as a mirror and amplifier. He does not force the transformation, but stimulates it with example. This is what makes his leadership so special at this moment, his ability to remind the world that caring for the elderly is, above all, a sign of collective maturity. Within this logic, a new perception about aging begins to form. For a long time, aging was associated with loss, the end, uselessness. Cayce always questioned this view. For him, aging was a necessary stage of expansion of consciousness. It was the moment when the human being becomes closer to the essence. And perhaps that is why he gave so much prominence to the elderly in his predictions, not as fragile figures to be protected, but as mature consciousnesses that have much to offer. The current Pope, by rescuing this value through his actions and speeches, helps to rebuild this social image of aging. And in doing so, he also contributes to the elderly themselves seeing themselves differently. After all, when we are treated with respect, we begin to remember who we really are. And that, according to Cayce, is the first step to any true healing. The healing he spoke of was not only physical. It was a healing of the relationship between generations, a healing of the wounds left by forgetfulness. Many elderly people carry in silence the weight of exclusion, the feeling of uselessness, emotional abandonment. Cayce knew this, and his messages always pointed to the importance of healing these pains through listening, presence, and recognition. The Pope, by directing direct words to the elderly, by including their faces in the official images of the Church, is offering more than a symbolic gesture. He is saying that these lives matter, that there is a place for everyone in the story that is still being written. And perhaps that is why so many elderly people around the world felt touched by the choice of this new leadership. Because for the first time in a long time, someone in a position of power is saying with simplicity and firmness that they should never have been forgotten. As this new awareness spreads, we begin to realize how it impacts all age groups. When the youngest see the elderly being valued, they learn to project a future with more dignity for themselves. When adults rediscover the strength of accumulated wisdom, they find ways to make more balanced decisions. And when the elderly themselves see themselves respected, they find meaning and belonging again. Cayce described this cycle as a natural movement of the collective soul, something that begins almost imperceptibly, but gains strength as more people awaken to its value. The new Pope, without making this a centralized discourse, is conducting this process with humility and persistence, and the result is visible. A new atmosphere begins to form around old age, not as a problem to be solved, but as a wealth to be celebrated and protected. If Cayce were alive today, he might say that the world is finally beginning to hear what has been written for a long time. His readings never intended to impose truths, but to ignite possibilities. And now, as we observe this cultural transformation happening in tune with his words, we gain not only a new look at the present, but also a responsibility for the future. The end of the era of forgotten elderly is not a guaranteed destiny. It is an ongoing process that depends on our daily involvement. It is in the way we talk to our grandparents, in the time we dedicate to their stories, in the decisions we make collectively, that this new era is confirmed. The new Pope may be the symbol of this turnaround, but it is we who decide whether it will become permanent. The choice is in our hands, in our gestures, and in our words. Therefore, if you have made it this far, perhaps this topic has already touched something important within you. And that's a good sign. It means that Cayce's message has found an echo and that the change he envisioned is closer than we imagine. If this reflection made sense to you, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving your like or comment. Not out of vanity, but so that this conversation continues. Because by talking about this, we inspire others to look more closely at those who have lived so much. And this is the real turning point. Cayce believed that the future would be shaped by conscious choices made with an open heart and with eyes turned to what really matters. And perhaps by honoring the elderly, we are finally beginning to write a new chapter for everyone.